The hardest part isn't that she lied. It's admitting you saw the truth all along, and you chose the beautiful, painful fantasy instead. You kept choosing it every single day until the story broke. You weren't waiting for her to come back. You were waiting for the person you invented to finally show up. It begins with a quiet negotiation, a silent contract you make with yourself in the dead of night, when the loneliness feels too vast to hold. You agree to believe in one thing, just one thing, with such force that it crowds out everything else. You believe in the story, and the price of admission to that story is your own perception, your own intuition. This wasn't a sudden break from reality, a single moment of delusion. It was a slow, methodical construction of a ghost you desperately needed to be real, someone you could build a future on, even if the foundation was nothing more than air and hope. You weren't just haunted. You were the one holding the candle, leading the spirit through the empty hallways of your own heart. There are words for this process, for this intricate architecture of self-deception. According to Brené Brown, we build these fantasies not out of foolishness, but out of a desperate, primal need for belonging. We armor ourselves with a beautiful story. She explains, to avoid the raw vulnerability of admitting the connection we crave isn't actually there. Because that reality, the one where the chair opposite you is truly empty, feels infinitely more threatening than any lie you have to tell yourself to keep the illusion alive. The fantasy isn't the weakness. It's the shield. It's the heavy armor you put on every morning just to face a world in which you feel unseen. This is not a failure of your intelligence. Far from it. Gabor Mate adds that this pattern is often a trauma response, an echo in the bones. When our earliest needs for attachment were unmet, we learned a devastating survival skill: to abandon our own gut feelings, to silence the self, in order to keep a connection, no matter how fragile or painful it became. You learned that your own perception was the price of admission into someone else's world. So when you look back, understand this: you weren't just ignoring the truth about her. You were reenacting a script written for you long ago, a survival pattern where sacrificing your own clarity felt safer than facing the silence of being alone. You were simply doing what you had always been trained to do, choosing a painful connection over no connection at all. Started there, didn't it? In the gap, the unsettling space between the words she spoke and the energy she gave off. It was a chronic dissonance you learned to tolerate, then normalize, and finally to defend. It was the feeling of reading a text that said, "I miss you," while your body registered the truth, that you hadn't heard from her in days, and wouldn't again for several more. It was the hollow promise of "we'll see each other soon," followed by a calendar full of empty spaces and vague excuses. You heard the promise, but you felt the distance. And in that gap, you were forced to make a choice over and over again. You chose the words. You chose to believe the blueprint, even when you were standing in an empty field with no foundation in sight. This misalignment became the quiet, humming soundtrack to your connection. It was the chronic tension in your shoulders as you waited for a call that was supposed to come, the slight sickness in your stomach when her actions once again contradicted her reassurances. You became an expert translator of inconsistency, a scholar of mixed messages. You told yourself stories to bridge the gap. She's just busy with work. She's afraid of how deep her feelings are. This is just how she is. You accepted the echo as the real sound and dismissed the silence that followed as your own insecurity. You learned to live in a house where the lights flickered constantly, and instead of checking the wiring, you simply learned to see in the dark. It's like standing in a room with someone whispering vows of closeness, but their shadow on the wall, cast by the only light source, is already turned and halfway out the door. You heard the whisper. It was beautiful. It was everything you wanted to hear, and you chose to close your eyes and listen to it, believing that if you focused hard enough, the shadow would stop moving. You decided to believe that the sound was more real than the sight. You taught yourself that her love was in the words, the promises, the echoes, not in her presence, her effort, or her gaze. And so you stood there, in that room, listening to a ghost, pretending you couldn't see the shape of her absence already moving toward the exit. From that choice, the choice to listen to the echo instead of the silence, you began to build. It's important to see this next part clearly, not as a source of shame, but as a testament to your own capacity for hope. You must give yourself credit for the sheer scale of the project. You were not a passive resident in this fantasy. You were its chief architect. You weren't just swept away by a story. You wrote it, edited it, and illustrated it with your own longing. She didn't hand you a finished dream. She handed you scraps, and from those scraps, you built a world. She would offer a crumb of affection, a brief late-night text after a long period of quiet, a fleeting moment of warmth in her voice, and you would treat it like a feast. You didn't just eat the crumb. You planted it, watered it with your attention, and tried to grow a garden. Imagine being led to a plot of land and being handed a handful of broken bricks. Some cracked, some crumbling, all of them unfit for use. And a voice, her voice, or perhaps the voice of your own hope, tells you, this is your foundation. The evidence is right there in your hands. You can feel the grit, the instability, the way the pieces don't fit together. And instead of questioning the material, instead of demanding something solid, you knelt and began to work. You worked tirelessly to build a home, using the mortar of your own hope to fill the gaps. That mortar was your forgiveness. It was your patience. It was your ability to overlook inconsistencies, to explain away her absences, to believe in her potential instead of her reality. You poured your own strength into holding it all together. And so you built this sanctuary on unstable ground. You decorated the walls with every good memory, no matter how small. You installed windows that only looked out onto a future you imagined, never onto the present reality of your loneliness. You became the sole keeper of this place, tending to a fire that she never helped you feed. You were so busy working as the architect of your own heartbreak that you never stopped to realize how alone you were inside the very structure you were killing yourself to create. You weren't just living in a fragile house. You were the only pillar holding up its roof, and you knew, deep down, you were growing tired. Let's be honest with ourselves. Here in this quiet space where no one else can hear, this wasn't ignorance. It was a choice. A painful, active, and continuous choice to be blind. It wasn't that the red flags weren't there. They were planted all over the landscape of your relationship. They fluttered in the wind of every canceled plan, every unanswered message, every moment you felt a cold distance when you were sitting right next to her. The truth is, you saw them. You saw every single one. And you made the decision day after day to tell yourself they were just part of the scenery. You chose not to see them as warnings, because the story you were living in was far more comfortable than the sharp, cold reality they pointed to. That reality was simply this: you were more invested. You were more present. You were more in love than she ever was. And to admit that felt like a judgment, a fundamental failure on your part. So you chose the comfort of a beautiful story over the sharpness of that devastating truth. This willful blindness became a daily ritual. It was the conscious decision to unfocus your eyes when looking at the picture of your life together. You knew, somewhere deep down, that if you let your vision come into sharp focus, you would see the photograph was torn right down the middle, held together by nothing but your own hopeful hands. So you squinted. You looked at it through a haze, letting the jagged tear blur into a soft, indistinct line. You chose the beautiful, blurry image because the clarity was unbearable. It was the deliberate act of rereading a loving text from 3 weeks ago to drown out the silence of today. It was the active choice to remember the one time she looked at you with warmth, and to forget the 100 times her eyes were vacant and elsewhere. This wasn't passive denial. It was an exhausting, full-time job. You became the tireless curator of a false narrative. You spent your energy not on the connection itself, but on managing your perception of it. Every time a new crack appeared in the foundation of the sanctuary you built, you didn't run. You ran for plaster. You worked tirelessly to smooth over the inconsistencies, to repaint the faded colors, to convince yourself that the creaking sounds were just the house settling, not the sign of an imminent collapse. The blindness was not a state of being. It was a constant, draining action. It was the choice to keep the curtains drawn so you would never have to see what was truly waiting on the other side of the glass. Here, we must make a crucial separation, a fork in the road of your understanding that may change how you see everything. The immense pull you felt, the obsessive thoughts, the inability to let go. You called it love, you called it addiction, but you may have misidentified the substance. You were not addicted to her. You were not addicted to the person who stood before you, with all her inconsistencies, her distance, and her flaws. You were addicted to the hope she represented. She was not the drug. She was the symbol of the cure you had been searching for your entire life. Her validation was the chemical, and the fantasy of a future with her was the needle you used to administer it again and again. She became the physical embodiment of a future where you were finally healed, finally chosen, finally complete. Her attention, however scarce, was proof that you were worthy of attention. Her brief moments of warmth were evidence that you were capable of being loved. The addiction was to that feeling of possibility, the intoxicating rush that came with the thought, maybe this time it will be different. Maybe I will be enough for her. You weren't chasing her. You were chasing a version of yourself that you believed only she could unlock. A version that was no longer lonely, no longer invisible, no longer left behind. That potential version of your life was the most potent drug imaginable, and she was simply the one who held the key. Imagine you are a person dying of thirst, crawling through a vast and empty desert. Your throat is raw, your body is weak, and on the horizon, you see it. A shimmering oasis, lush and green, promising everything you need to survive. You would crawl toward it with every last ounce of your strength. You would fixate on it, dream of it, and ignore all signs that it might not be real. You aren't addicted to the sand, or the heat, or the pain of the journey. You are addicted to the idea of water. She was that mirage. The addiction was never to the reality of who she was, the hot sand and empty distance. It was to the life-saving relief you projected onto her, the shimmering possibility of an oasis that could finally quench a thirst you've carried for a very, very long time. And then comes the collapse. It's rarely a single, dramatic explosion. More often, it is a slow, quiet dawning. A final inconsistency you can no longer explain away. A prolonged silence that becomes too heavy to bear. The moment the mirage finally evaporates, leaving you staring at nothing but empty sand and sky, the cathedral of hope you so carefully constructed comes down. Not in a storm, but with a silent, gut-wrenching crumble, leaving nothing but dust and the echo of your own prayers. In that deafening quiet, the real grief begins, but it is a strange and disorienting sorrow. You find yourself mourning someone who is still alive, grieving a loss that no one else can see. The devastation you feel isn't for the person you lost, but for the person you thought they were. You are mourning the ghost you created, the one you so lovingly dressed in their flesh and blood. You grieve the version of her that existed only in your mind, the one who was on the verge of committing, the one who understood the depths of your soul, the one whose hidden warmth was just about to break through the surface. That is the person who has vanished. That person has died, and you are the only one attending the funeral. It is a lonely, isolating wake, because you cannot explain to anyone that you are grieving for a potential, for a future, for a beautiful character you authored and then fell in love with. It feels exactly like waking from an intensely vivid dream. In the dream, you were deeply and completely loved. You felt their hand in yours. You heard their voice whispering your name. You felt the warmth of their body next to you. And for a few fleeting seconds after you open your eyes, the feeling of that love is still real, still lingering on your skin. Then you reach out. You reach for the person you swore was sleeping beside you just a moment ago, and your hand meets nothing but the cold, empty space of the pillow. The shock of it is physical. The abrupt transition from the warmth of the dream to the cold finality of reality is breathtakingly painful. The loss feels so real because the love you felt in the dream was absolutely real. The love you poured into your fantasy was the most real thing in your life. The pain is not an illusion. It is the brutal price of waking up. And now we must ask the most difficult question. Why her? Of all the people in the world, why did you choose someone so clearly distant, so emotionally unavailable, to be the center of your universe? The answer is both complex and painfully simple. You weren't just meeting a person, you were casting a role. And the script for that role was written long, long before she ever walked onto the stage of your life. Deep inside you, perhaps so deep you rarely acknowledge it, there is a pre-existing wound of unworthiness. It is the quiet, chronic belief that you are fundamentally not enough. Not smart enough, not attractive enough, not interesting enough to be chosen freely and loved completely. It is a wound you have been trying to heal for years. And so, you handed her the part of the savior. Without her knowledge or consent, you cast her as the one person whose love was so difficult to win that finally attaining it would silence that voice of unworthiness forever. Her validation was not just validation. It was redemption. Her choosing you would be the cure for that old, aching wound. This is why her inconsistency was so magnetic. The challenge she presented made the potential prize seem all the more valuable. If you could just get her to see you, to choose you, to stay with you, then it would finally prove that the old wound was a lie. The entire relationship became a high-stakes test, and her love was the passing grade you desperately needed to feel whole. It's like handing a complete stranger a heavy, leather-bound script the moment you meet them. In this script, they are cast as the hero destined to rescue you from a lonely tower. You've written all their lines, lines of devotion, of understanding, of unwavering presence. And then you stand back and watch them, waiting for them to perform. You get frustrated, then hurt, then angry when they can't remember their lines, when they improvise with words of indifference, when they wander off stage entirely. You feel betrayed by their performance, never realizing the deeper truth. They never auditioned for the part. They never even knew there was a play. The profound pain you feel now is not just the pain of her absence. It is the agony of watching your masterpiece, your one hope for a happy ending, fail. And it feels like a damning verdict on the playwright himself. That grand fantasy, the one you constructed with such care, served another purpose beyond healing an old wound. It was also your most trusted shield. The elaborate future you imagined, the trips you would take, the quiet mornings you would share, the way she would finally look at you with unguarded love. It wasn't just a hope. It was a powerful defense mechanism, an armor you wore to protect yourself from the cold, unbearable emptiness of your present. The dream of one day with her was your only refuge from the pain of right now without her. It was the place you went when the silence in your apartment became too loud, when another Friday night passed with no text, when the feeling of being utterly alone became a physical weight on your chest. You used the future to medicate the present. Whenever the ache of loneliness became too sharp, you would retreat into that imagined world. You could conjure it at will. You could close your eyes and feel the warmth of a life that did not exist, hear conversations that would never happen, and feel a sense of belonging that reality never offered. This imagined world was reliable, consistent, and always available. It was a sanctuary that was always open, unlike the real person, who offered only intermittent access and fleeting moments of connection. The fantasy wasn't just a daydream. It was your fortress. It was the one place you could go where you were never chosen last, never left unanswered, and never invisible. It's like you are standing in a cold, desolate, empty room. The walls are bare, the air is stale, and a profound sense of abandonment hangs in the air. But you are not looking at the room. You are holding a small, beautiful painting right up to your face, so close that it fills your entire field of vision. The painting depicts a warm, sunlit landscape, a place of peace and connection. You stare into it so intently that you can almost feel the warmth on your skin. The painting itself is not the problem. It's a masterpiece of hope. The problem is that you are using it as a shield to block the view of the desolate room you are actually standing in. And while that shield protected you from the pain of your reality, it also kept you trapped inside it, unable to ever leave the room because you had convinced yourself you were already living in the landscape of the painting. And here we arrive at the heart of the matter, at the deepest and most intimate wound. Because the ultimate betrayal, the one that leaves the most painful and lasting scar, was not hers. It was yours. The real heartbreak wasn't that she abandoned you, but that you abandoned yourself first, over and over again. Your intuition, that quiet, primal compass inside you, it knew the truth from the very beginning. It sent a jolt through your gut when her words felt hollow. It whispered warnings in the dead of night when you were staring at your phone, waiting for a reply that you knew wasn't coming. It was a knot in your stomach, a tightness in your chest, a persistent, nagging feeling that something was fundamentally wrong. It was your own internal guardian, telling you, this path is not safe, this ground is not solid. And every single time it spoke, you told it to be quiet. You silenced it for one more moment inside the beautiful, fragile fantasy. You reasoned with it, you dismissed it, you called it paranoia. You're overthinking things, you told yourself. You're just insecure because of your past. You actively took the side of the fantasy against the truth of your own body. This is the source of the shame that lingers now, long after the anger and sadness have begun to fade. It is the shame of knowing, on some level, that you knew. You knew all along and you chose not to listen. That self-betrayal is a far lonelier pain than any heartbreak another person can inflict upon you. Imagine that you were born with a perfect, finely tuned compass. Its needle is crafted from unbreakable truth, and it always, without fail, points to your own true north. Throughout this entire relationship, that compass was in your hand. Its needle was vibrating, humming with a clear and steady signal, pointing away from her and toward your own well-being. But you didn't want it to point north. You wanted it to point in the direction she was walking. So you held it in your fist, and with all your strength, you tried to force the needle to turn. You pushed against its perfect mechanism, trying to break its will and bend it to your own. The faint, cracking sound you might have heard was not her heart breaking. It was the sound of your own inner guidance system, your most sacred instrument of truth, shattering under the pressure of your own hope. The loss of her is painful, but the loss of trust in your own compass is devastating. Let's give this dynamic its final, proper name so that you may see it clearly, perhaps for the first time. What you were in was not a partnership. A partnership is a space between two equals, a shared effort of building, giving, and receiving. It is a bridge built from both sides, meeting in the middle. What you had was a construction site on one side of a chasm, and empty air on the other. You weren't in a relationship of equals. You were a lone worshiper at an altar you built, bowing to a ruler who never asked for the crown and never felt its weight. You were a subject in a kingdom of one, and you were both the ruler and the ruled, the devotee and the silent God you prayed to. This final image may be the most important. You stand in a vast, cold, and echoing hall. In the center, there is a magnificent throne, intricately carved and adorned with gold. You recognize the carvings, the polish on the wood, the richness of the velvet, because you are the one who built it. You spent months, perhaps years, working on it alone. You are the one who forged a crown, heavy and beautiful, and with trembling, hopeful hands, you placed it on the head of the person you chose to rule your world. You saw them as royalty, as someone powerful and majestic, someone whose presence dignified the hall you built for them. The pain you feel now, the deep, hollowing agony, is not the pain of a loyal subject whose queen has abandoned the throne. It is the slow, dawning, and horrifying realization that you placed the crown upon the head of a statue. A beautiful, lifeless statue that could never acknowledge your devotion, appreciate your craftsmanship, or rule alongside you. It could only sit there, inanimate, while you projected all your hopes and dreams onto its cold surface. And now the statue is gone, or perhaps it was never truly there at all, and you are left standing utterly alone in the magnificent empty hall you built. The crushing silence is the sound of you finally seeing the truth. There was no kingdom. There was only your labor, your devotion, and an empty, empty throne. And so you are left here, standing in the rubble of the world you built. The air is thick with the dust of the collapsed fantasy, and the silence is heavy. It is a place of profound pain, but it is also, for the first time, a place of profound truth. It is here, in the wreckage, that the real work begins. Brené Brown teaches that true, wholehearted belonging can never grow in the soil of fantasy. It is born, she says, from the courage to stand in the rubble of what we hoped for, to look at what is real, however imperfect, and dare to be seen for who we are, not who we pretend to be for someone else. This desolate landscape is not a punishment. It is the only ground upon which something real can ever be built. The final, painful, and liberating truth is this: the person you projected onto them was not a lie. As the psychologist Carl Jung would argue, they were a mirror. The image you fell in love with was a perfect reflection of your own shadow. Not the dark parts, but the brilliant, golden parts of yourself that you had given away. It was a reflection of your own unlived potential, your own capacity for devotion, and your own desperate, unmet needs for a love you were never taught how to give to yourself. You saw a savior in them because you were unknowingly looking at a mirror reflecting the savior locked inside of you. The collapse of this fantasy, then, is not an ending. It is a summons. It is a brutal, painful, and necessary invitation to turn away from the empty throne and begin the sacred, terrifying work of reclaiming those parts of yourself you projected onto them. The grief is the signpost. The pain is the signal that it is time to sift through this rubble, not to rebuild the same fragile cathedral, but to find the golden pieces of your own soul that you used as building materials. The love you were so willing to give to a ghost must now, finally, be turned back toward the one who has been waiting in the wreckage all along. You. We have a short guide on a concept called emotional sovereignty, the first step in taking back the parts of yourself you gave away. It's not a solution. It's a map back to the point of self-betrayal. The link is in the description. It's free and it's honest. This realization is not the end of the pain. It is the beginning of a different kind. If you are ready to stop building sanctuaries for others and start understanding the foundation within yourself, that conversation happens elsewhere. This was never about them, but you will only understand why, on the other side,